Still unemployed at 67? My sister's boyfriend asked loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. The laughter came fast. A few nervous chuckles. A few genuine laughs. One person nearly spilled her drink. I smiled and took a sip of iced tea. What none of them knew was that before the year was over, that same man would wish he had never said those words. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 67 years old, and according to Brandon Hayes, I was the family embarrassment. The family dinner was supposed to be a celebration. My mother had just turned 88, and my sister Nicole had rented a private room at a country club outside Columbus, Ohio. The room overlooked a golf course painted gold by the evening sun. White tablecloths covered the tables. Crystal glasses reflected warm light from the chandeliers above. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked peaceful. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying a homemade lemon cake. My mother always preferred homemade desserts over anything from a bakery. She used to say that effort tasted better than sugar. When I walked into the room, Nicole barely looked up from her phone. "Just put it on the dessert table," she said. No hug. No smile. No thank you. I told myself not to take it personally. Over the years, I had become very good at telling myself that. Brandon arrived 20 minutes later. He entered the room like a man walking onto a stage. Expensive watch. Tailored jacket. Bright white smile. He shook hands with people who hadn't asked for one and laughed at jokes nobody had made. The family seemed impressed by him. Brandon always knew how to create that effect. My cousins gathered around him. My nephews listened to his stories about business deals and luxury vacations. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Every laugh seemed timed. I stayed near my mother. We talked about her garden, about the tomatoes she hoped to plant in the spring, about ordinary things, safe things. Then dinner began. The servers brought plates of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Conversation flowed easily. Brandon dominated most of it. He talked about investments, about networking, about successful people. Eventually, his attention landed on me. I noticed the shift immediately. Some people can sense a storm before the clouds appear. "So, Evelyn," he said, leaning back in his chair, "are you still unemployed?" The room grew quiet. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Several faces turned toward me. I set down my glass carefully. "I suppose that depends on your definition of work," I answered. Brandon laughed. "That's usually what unemployed people say." This time the laughter was louder. Even Nicole smiled. My sister didn't say a word in my defense. Not one. My mother stared down at her plate. I could see the discomfort in her eyes, but age had made her cautious. She hated conflict. Brandon wasn't finished. "You know," he continued, "most people retire after they actually have careers." More laughter. I looked around the room. People I'd known for decades suddenly seemed like strangers. People who had attended my wedding. People who had visited my home. People who knew almost nothing about the choices that had shaped my life. They knew the surface story. Evelyn doesn't work. Evelyn lives quietly. Evelyn keeps to herself. They didn't know what came before. They didn't know what I had given up. And they certainly didn't know what I still owned. I smiled again. Calmly. Politely. The same way I had smiled through 1,000 disappointments. Brandon interpreted my silence as weakness. People often do. The conversation moved on, but something had changed. I noticed Brandon checking his phone repeatedly beneath the table. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the hallway. At one point, he stepped outside to take a call. When he returned, his confidence seemed even larger than before. Almost desperate. Almost forced. I watched him from across the room. For the first time that evening, I began to wonder why a man so eager to appear successful seemed so nervous whenever he thought nobody was looking. The dinner ended a little after 9 o'clock. People gathered their coats, exchanged hugs, and drifted toward the parking lot beneath the soft glow of the country club lights. I helped my mother into Nicole's car and kissed her on the cheek before stepping back. She squeezed my hand for a moment longer than usual. There was something apologetic in her eyes, something she could not quite say aloud. Then the door closed and the car pulled away. I drove home alone. The roads were quiet. Cornfields stretched into the darkness on both sides of the highway. My headlights cut a narrow path through the night. Brandon's comments should have bothered me more than they did. Years ago, they would have. Years ago, I might have spent the entire drive replaying every word. But age changes certain things. At some point, you stop worrying about what people think and start noticing why they think it. That question stayed with me. Why was Brandon so determined to convince everyone that he was successful and I was not? When I arrived home, I turned on the lamp beside my favorite chair and sat quietly for a while. The house felt peaceful. No laughter, no performance, no audience, just silence. I preferred it that way. My gaze drifted toward an old framed photograph on the bookshelf. It showed me and my father standing outside a small office building nearly 30 years earlier. He had his arm around my shoulder. I was holding a set of blueprints. We both looked exhausted and proud. Few people remembered those days now. Fewer still understood them. The next morning, I woke just after 6. I made coffee and carried the mug onto the back porch. A cool Ohio breeze moved through the trees. The neighborhood was still asleep. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a message from Nicole. For a brief second, I wondered whether she had called to apologize for Brandon's behavior. Instead, the message read, "Brandon was only joking last night. Do not take it personally." I stared at the screen. Then I smiled. That sentence told me more than she realized. People only defend behavior they know is wrong. I set the phone down without replying. Around noon, I drove into town to pick up groceries. As I walked through the produce section, I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Thomas Bennett approaching with a shopping basket. Thomas had been a close friend of my father's for decades. He was retired now, but he had spent most of his life practicing corporate law. Sharp mind, sharp eyes. The kind of man who noticed details other people missed. We exchanged greetings and spoke for several minutes. Then he asked an unexpected question. "Nicole still seeing that fellow Brandon?" I nodded. Thomas frowned slightly. "Interesting." That single word caught my attention. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated. "Perhaps it is nothing." I waited. Thomas was not a man who said perhaps unless he already knew something. Finally, he leaned closer. "I attended a business luncheon downtown last month. I am fairly certain I saw him there." "That does not sound unusual," I said. "No," Thomas replied slowly. "What was unusual was the way he introduced himself." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean?" Thomas adjusted his glasses. He was telling people he had strong connections to a family business with significant assets. He spoke as though access to that family was part of his future. He paused. The family name he mentioned was Carter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of shopping carts echoed around us. Someone pushed a display of apples past the aisle. Thomas studied my expression carefully. "Perhaps I misunderstood," he said. But I knew he had not. And for the first time since that dinner, I began to suspect that Brandon's interest in my family had very little to do with love and far more to do with something else entirely. Thomas and I stood beside the produce section for another few minutes, but my mind had already moved somewhere else. The conversation kept replaying in pieces. Family business, significant assets, future access. Brandon had only been part of Nicole's life for a little over a year, yet somehow he was speaking about the Carter family as though he already belonged to it, as though he had a claim to something. I finished my shopping, drove home, and spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about things I had not thought about in years. Most people in my family saw me as the quiet older sister who lived alone and kept a small routine. They saw what was visible. They did not see history. They did not see sacrifice. They certainly did not see the thousands of decisions that it shaped our family long before Brandon ever appeared. That evening, I opened an old cedar chest in the corner of my study. Inside were photo albums, documents, letters, and business records that had belonged to my father. The scent of aged paper drifted into the room. I sat on the floor and carefully lifted one folder after another. There we were, my father and I standing beside the first office we ever leased. My father shaking hands with clients. Me reviewing contracts at a folding table long before we could afford proper furniture. Back then, Nicole had been building her own life in another state. She had never been involved in the business. She had never wanted to be. My father used to joke that I inherited his patience while Nicole inherited his charm. Both had value, but only one helped build companies. I smiled at the memory and continued sorting through the files. The deeper I looked, the clearer something became. Over the years, many family members had forgotten where certain opportunities came from. Success has a strange way of rewriting history. People enjoy the rewards long after they stop remembering who created them. 2 days later, Nicole called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "We are having another family gathering next weekend," she said. "Just something casual at our house. You should come." I almost declined. Then I remembered Thomas's words. "I will be there," I said. Saturday arrived bright and warm. Nicole lived in a large home on the edge of a new development outside the city. Expensive houses lined the streets. Fresh landscaping. New driveways. The kind of neighborhood designed to impress visitors. When I walked inside, Brandon was already entertaining a group of relatives in the living room. He was telling another story about business. This time it involved investors, private meetings, and opportunities most people supposedly could not understand. Heads nodded around the room. People seemed fascinated. I stood quietly near the kitchen island and listened. The details sounded polished. Too polished. Like someone repeating lines practiced in front of a mirror. Then I noticed something else. Every time Brandon discussed money, his attention drifted toward certain people. Toward my mother. Toward Nicole. Toward family members connected to property, investments, or inheritance. Never toward anyone else. It was subtle. Easy to miss. But once I saw it, I could not stop seeing it. Later that afternoon, while carrying empty glasses toward the kitchen, I passed the hallway leading to Nicole's office. The door was partially open. Brandon stood inside speaking on the phone. His voice was low, but one sentence reached me clearly. "Once everything is finalized, access will not be a problem." I kept walking. I did not pause. I did not let him know I had heard anything. But a cold certainty settled quietly into my thoughts. Brandon was not simply trying to impress the family. He was positioning himself for something much larger. The question was no longer whether he had an agenda. The question was how far he was willing to go to achieve it. The following week passed quietly on the surface, but my thoughts were anything but quiet. Once you notice a pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore it. I began paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me, especially when Brandon was involved. What surprised me most was not his behavior. It was how willingly other people accepted it. Confidence can be persuasive, even when it is built on very little. People often mistake certainty for competence. Brandon seemed to understand that better than anyone. On Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from my mother. She wanted help sorting through some old family papers stored in boxes at her house. I drove over the next morning. The boxes had been sitting in a spare bedroom closet for years. Tax records, property documents, old photographs, letters, pieces of a family's history packed away and forgotten. While my mother rested in the living room, I worked through the files one by one. Hours passed. Dust covered my hands. Sunlight moved slowly across the carpet. Then I found something interesting. Tucked inside a folder labeled Estate Planning was a collection of documents I had not seen in years. My father's notes, business agreements, ownership records. I sat down and began reading carefully. The memories came back immediately. Long nights, difficult decisions, risks nobody else had wanted to take. My father and I had built much of what later benefited the entire family. Not because we wanted recognition, simply because someone had to do the work. I remembered meetings that lasted until midnight. Weekends spent reviewing contracts. Years of sacrifice while others enjoyed the results. Most of those details had faded from family conversations over time. Success had become normal. Its origins had become invisible. As I continued reading, another realization settled over me. Brandon could not possibly know the full story. He only knew fragments. Surface details. Enough to sound informed at dinner parties, but not enough to understand what actually existed beneath the surface. That afternoon, my mother joined me at the kitchen table. She looked through several old photographs and smiled. Then her expression softened. "Your father always trusted your judgment," she said quietly. I looked up. She rarely spoke about those years. "He trusted both of us," I replied. She shook her head gently. "Not in the same way." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she added something that stayed with me long after I left. "Some people see value only after they think they can lose it." The next evening, Nicole invited several relatives to dinner again. Nothing formal, just family. I almost declined. Then I remembered my mother's words. So I went. The atmosphere felt relaxed when I arrived. People chatted in the backyard. Children played near the patio. Brandon stood beside the grill, telling another story. This one involved a potential business opportunity and several influential contacts. The details shifted each time he told it, but nobody seemed to notice. At one point, he mentioned future plans involving family resources. The phrase caught my attention immediately. Family resources. Not his resources. Not earned resources. Family resources. Later, While carrying empty plates into the kitchen, I overheard a conversation between Brandon and Nicole. They did not realize I was nearby. Once everything is settled, things will be much easier, Brandon said. Nicole sounded uncertain. Do you really think that is necessary? There was a pause. Then Brandon answered with calm confidence. Trust me, it is the smartest move. The conversation ended before I could hear more. I continued walking without making a sound. Outside, laughter drifted through the open windows. The evening looked normal, ordinary, but beneath that calm surface, something was moving into place. I could feel it. Brandon believed he was several steps ahead of everyone else. He believed nobody was paying attention, and that confidence was beginning to reveal more than he realized. 3 days later, an unexpected letter arrived in my mailbox. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address printed on the front. Inside was a formal invitation to a retirement luncheon being held downtown by a regional business association. Normally, I would have ignored it. Over the years, I had attended enough meetings and networking events to lose interest in most of them. But one detail caught my attention. Brandon's name appeared on the list of featured guests. I sat at my kitchen table reading the invitation twice. Then a third time. The event was scheduled for the following Friday. Something told me I should attend. Friday arrived clear and warm. I chose a simple navy suit and drove into the city. The luncheon was held inside a large conference center overlooking the river. Round tables filled the ballroom. Business owners, attorneys, consultants, and investors moved through the room exchanging handshakes and business cards. It felt familiar, more familiar than family gatherings had felt lately. Nobody here cared whether I was retired. Nobody cared whether I worked 40 hours a week. They cared about results. They cared about reputation. They cared about facts. I checked in quietly and took a seat near the back. Brandon arrived nearly 30 minutes later. He entered with the same confidence I had seen so many times before. Expensive suit, bright smile, firm handshake. He moved from table to table greeting people as though he already belonged among them. Several attendees seemed impressed. Others looked politely interested. I watched without drawing attention to myself. Then, something unexpected happened. An older gentleman approached Brandon and greeted him warmly. The two men began talking. A few moments later, I recognized the older man immediately. It was Richard Monroe. Years ago, Richard had worked closely with my father on several major projects. He was respected throughout the business community. More importantly, Richard remembered things. He remembered people. He remembered history. I saw Brandon speaking confidently while Richard listened. Then Richard's expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. A small narrowing of the eyes. A subtle pause. The kind of reaction that appears when something does not quite add up. Later, during lunch, I happened to pass Richard near the coffee station. He recognized me instantly. Evelyn Carter, he said with a smile. It has been years. We spoke briefly. Then his expression grew thoughtful. Interesting young man, you have connected to your family these days. I knew immediately whom he meant. You have met Brandon? I asked. Richard nodded. He seems eager to discuss the Carter legacy. The phrase made me pause. Carter legacy. Not Carter family. Not Carter history. Carter legacy. Richard lowered his voice slightly. He speaks as though he has significant involvement in family assets and business interests. I remained silent. Richard studied me carefully. Then he added, I assumed he was much closer to those matters than he actually appears to be. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, people continued eating and talking. Glasses clinked. Waiters moved between tables. Life carried on as normal. Yet another piece had quietly fallen into place. Brandon was not simply speaking carelessly. He was presenting himself as something he was not. And he was doing it repeatedly. When the event ended, I walked toward the parking garage with a strange sense of calm. The picture was becoming clearer. Not complete, but clearer. Every conversation seemed to point in the same direction. Every small clue connected to the next. Brandon believed perception created reality. He believed that if enough people accepted his version of the story, then the truth no longer mattered. As I unlocked my car, I thought about my father. One lesson he repeated throughout my life returned to me with surprising clarity. A false reputation grows quickly, he used to say. But the truth has better endurance. Standing there beneath the afternoon sun, I realized something important. Brandon had spent months building an image. An image designed to impress people. An image designed to open doors. An image designed to gain trust. The problem was that images are fragile, and sooner or later, reality always asks for proof. The following Monday brought another surprise. Nicole called early in the morning, something she rarely did unless she wanted advice or a favor. Her voice sounded unusually excited. "Brandon has been working on something important," she said. "He wants to share it with the family soon." I stirred my coffee and listened. "What kind of project?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "A long-term financial opportunity," she replied. "Something that could benefit everyone." The wording immediately caught my attention. Benefit everyone. It sounded less like a plan and more like a sales pitch. I kept my voice calm. "That sounds ambitious." Nicole laughed softly. "You should hear him explain it. He has really impressed a lot of people." After we ended the call, I sat quietly at my kitchen table. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. The house felt peaceful, but my thoughts were moving quickly. Every conversation seemed to lead toward the same destination. Brandon was preparing something. He was building momentum. More importantly, he was building trust. That afternoon, I decided to visit my mother. She was sitting on her porch wrapped in a light sweater despite the mild weather. We talked about ordinary things at first. The garden, the neighborhood, the latest church fundraiser. Eventually, the conversation turned toward Nicole and Brandon. My mother sighed. "He certainly has confidence." I smiled slightly. "That is one way to describe it." She looked at me for a moment. "You see something that worries you." It was not a question. I nodded. "I think he is very interested in this family." My mother stared toward the yard. "More interested than he should be?" she asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. Then I said, "Possibly." Her expression became thoughtful. "Your father always believed character reveals itself over time." I remembered those words long after I drove home. Character reveals itself over time. The next few days brought more small pieces of information. A cousin mentioned that Brandon had been asking questions about family property. An uncle casually repeated a conversation about inheritance planning that Brandon had somehow inserted himself into. Another relative mentioned hearing him discuss future family assets as though they were already connected to him personally. None of these comments proved anything by themselves, but together they painted a picture. Brandon was studying the family, measuring it, evaluating it, looking for opportunity. By Thursday evening, Nicole sent a group message inviting everyone to dinner the following weekend. According to her message, Brandon wanted to present an exciting proposal. The wording sounded formal, deliberate, almost corporate. Family members responded enthusiastically. Several expressed curiosity. Others praised Brandon before hearing a single detail. I read the messages without commenting. Then my phone rang. It was Thomas Bennett. His voice carried the same calm professionalism it always had. "Evelyn," he said, "I came across something interesting today." I listened carefully. "What kind of interesting?" He paused. "The kind that confirms instincts." My attention sharpened immediately. Thomas continued, "Let us just say I found additional reasons to be cautious about your sister's boyfriend." I stood and walked toward the window. Rain clouds were gathering again beyond the trees. "Can you explain?" I asked. "Not yet," Thomas replied. "I would rather verify everything first." Another pause followed. Then he added one final sentence. "But if there is a family meeting next weekend, I strongly recommend that you attend." After the call ended, I remained standing by the window. The sky had grown darker. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the horizon. For the first time, I felt certain that whatever Brandon planned to unveil at that dinner would not go the way he expected. He believed he was preparing an opportunity. What he did not realize was that the people he underestimated were finally beginning to pay attention. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for early autumn. By the time I pulled into Nicole's driveway, several cars were already parked along the curb. Family members moved in and out of the house carrying dishes, desserts, and folding chairs. At first glance, it looked like any other family gathering. Children laughed in the backyard. Music drifted softly through open windows. The smell of grilled food filled the air. Yet beneath the familiar atmosphere, there was a noticeable sense of anticipation. People were curious about Brandon's announcement. They expected good news. They expected opportunity. Most of all, they expected Brandon to impress them. As I stepped inside, Nicole greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. She hugged me quickly and thanked me for coming. Her smile seemed forced. Not unhappy, just nervous. I noticed it immediately. Brandon, on the other hand, looked completely confident. He moved through the room shaking hands and accepting compliments before he had even presented anything. Several relatives gathered around him as though he were already celebrating a success. I quietly took a seat near the back of the living room. From there I could see everyone without attracting attention. My mother sat beside me. Thomas Bennett arrived a few minutes later and chose a chair near the opposite wall. When our eyes met briefly, he gave a small nod. Nothing more. But it told me enough. Whatever he had discovered, he had not forgotten it. Around 6 o'clock, Brandon finally stood and cleared his throat. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. The room became quiet. He thanked everyone for attending and began speaking about vision, growth, and opportunity. His presentation sounded polished, almost professional. Charts appeared on a television screen. Numbers filled several slides. He described future possibilities, investment potential, and long-term benefits. Family members listened carefully. Some appeared impressed. Others looked confused but interested. Brandon continued confidently. Then he began discussing resources. Family resources. Shared resources. Assets that could supposedly help create greater wealth for future generations. The language sounded strategic, inclusive, responsible. Yet the more he spoke, the more I noticed something important. Nearly every proposal required trust. Trust in him. Trust in his leadership. Trust in decisions that only he fully understood. At one point, Nicole stood beside him smiling proudly. She looked convinced that Brandon was helping everyone. Watching her stirred something painful inside me. Not anger. Concern. Nicole was not foolish. She was simply hopeful. Hope can sometimes blind people to warning signs they would otherwise recognize. The presentation lasted nearly 40 minutes. When Brandon finished, several relatives applauded. A few immediately began asking questions about participation. Others discussed possible contributions. Brandon answered each question smoothly. He appeared prepared for everything. Then my Uncle Raymond asked a simple question. Who reviewed the legal structure of this plan? For the first time all evening, Brandon hesitated. Only for a second. But I saw it. Thomas saw it too. Brandon quickly recovered and offered a vague answer involving advisors and consultations. The room accepted it and moved on. Yet something had changed. A small crack had appeared in the polished image. Later, as dessert was being served, I noticed Brandon speaking quietly with Nicole near the kitchen doorway. His expression remained confident, but there was tension beneath it now. The confidence looked practiced, maintained, controlled, as though he were working harder to sustain it. Meanwhile, Thomas remained unusually calm. He spent most of the evening observing rather than participating. That alone told me everything. He was waiting, not guessing, not suspecting, waiting. And as I watched the room fill with conversation once again, I realized we were approaching the moment when assumptions would finally meet facts. Brandon believed tonight had strengthened his position. He believed the family was moving closer to trusting him completely. What he did not realize was that the most important conversation of the evening had not happened yet. The conversation gradually settled into smaller groups after dessert. Coffee cups appeared. Plates were cleared away. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had earlier. Most relatives seemed satisfied by Brandon's presentation. A few were already discussing possibilities among themselves. Brandon moved through the room accepting compliments with the confidence of someone who believed the evening had been a complete success. Then Thomas Bennett stood up from his chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for attention. Yet somehow the room became quiet anyway. Years of experience have a way of creating their own authority. Thomas smiled politely and thanked Nicole for hosting everyone. Then he turned toward Brandon. I have a few questions, he said. Brandon nodded immediately. Of course. The confidence was still there. But I noticed him straighten slightly. Thomas began with simple matters. Corporate structure. Oversight. Legal review. Documentation. Brandon answered smoothly. Some relatives looked impressed by how quickly he responded. Then Thomas asked another question. This one was more specific. Brandon's answer became less precise. A few moments later came another question. Then another. Small details. Dates. Names. Professional relationships. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. Yet with each answer, the room grew a little quieter. Brandon remained calm, but his certainty was beginning to fade around the edges. Finally, Thomas reached into a folder he had brought with him. The movement immediately caught everyone's attention. He removed several papers and placed them on the table. I became curious after hearing about this proposal, he said. So I spent some time verifying public information. Nobody spoke. Even the children playing in the backyard seemed distant now. Thomas continued. Several professional affiliations mentioned tonight do not appear to exist in the form described. Certain partnerships appear exaggerated. Some credentials have been presented in ways that create impressions not fully supported by the available records. The words were careful, professional, precise, yet their impact was immediate. Brandon attempted a smile. There must be some misunderstanding. Thomas nodded politely. That is certainly possible. Then he opened another document, which is why I checked twice. A heavy silence settled over the room. Nicole looked from Brandon to Thomas and back again. Confusion had replaced confidence in her expression. My mother sat quietly beside me, her hands folded in her lap. Brandon began explaining, clarifying, reframing. Each answer sounded reasonable on its own. Yet together they created a different impression than before. For the first time, people were not simply listening to what he said. They were evaluating it. That changed everything. A cousin who had praised the proposal earlier now looked uncertain. My uncle Raymond leaned back in his chair with crossed arms. Several relatives exchanged glances. Trust was no longer automatic. Questions had entered the room. Then Thomas said something that shifted the entire evening. There is one more matter. His voice remained calm. The repeated references to Carter family assets and legacy interests. Brandon's expression froze for a fraction of a second. It was brief, almost invisible, but I saw it. Thomas continued. My understanding is that you have represented yourself in several settings as someone with meaningful involvement in matters that are not actually under your authority. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Brandon attempted another explanation, but the words sounded weaker now, less certain. The image he had spent months constructing was beginning to crack. Not because anyone attacked him, not because anyone insulted him, simply because facts were being compared to claims. And facts are remarkably difficult to argue with. As the silence deepened, I realized something important. The evening was no longer about business proposals. It was no longer about investments. It was about credibility. And for the first time since I had met Brandon, the room was finally seeing the difference between confidence and character. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The room that had been filled with conversation only minutes earlier now felt completely different. Brandon looked around as though searching for someone to rescue the moment. Nobody did. The confidence that had carried him through so many family gatherings suddenly seemed much smaller. Nicole sat quietly beside him. Her eyes moved between the documents on the table and the man she thought she knew. Thomas did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply allowed the facts to remain where everyone could see them. That was enough. My uncle Raymond finally leaned forward. So these claims were not exactly accurate? He asked. Brandon immediately began explaining again. He talked about misunderstandings, future plans, intentions, and opportunities. But the room had changed. Earlier, people accepted his words as proof. Now they wanted proof for his words. There is a difference. A very important difference. My mother remained silent for a while before speaking. At 88, she had learned that the right sentence at the right moment often carries more weight than 100 arguments. She looked directly at Brandon and said, "Trust is easier to lose than it is to earn." Nobody disagreed. Nicole lowered her eyes. I could see the disappointment on her face. Not because a business proposal had failed. Not because an opportunity had disappeared. She was realizing that confidence and character are not always the same thing. The room remained quiet. Then something unexpected happened. Nicole turned toward me. "Evelyn," she said softly, "there is something I need to ask." I waited. "Why did you never say anything?" Several relatives looked at me. The answer came easily. Because nobody was asking. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. They understood what I meant. For months, many of them had listened to Brandon. Very few had listened to anyone else. They had accepted appearances because appearances were convenient. They had assumed silence meant weakness. They had assumed retirement meant irrelevance. They had assumed they already knew the full story. Thomas smiled slightly. "That is often how mistakes happen," he said. People stop asking questions. As the evening continued, conversations became more honest. Family members discussed concerns they had quietly ignored. Others admitted they had felt uncomfortable but had dismissed their instincts. Nobody was angry. Nobody was shouting. The truth did not need drama. It only needed daylight. Eventually, people began gathering their coats and preparing to leave. The atmosphere was calmer now, more genuine. Before I left, Nicole walked me to the front door. The night air felt cool and refreshing after the tension inside. She stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I am sorry." The words were simple, honest. That made them meaningful. I smiled and squeezed her hand. "We all make mistakes," I replied. "The important thing is recognizing them." She nodded. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she managed a small smile. As I walked toward my car, I thought back to that dinner weeks earlier when laughter had followed a careless insult. At the time, many people believed they understood exactly who I was. An unemployed older woman. Someone easy to overlook. Someone easy to dismiss. Yet life has a way of revealing deeper truths. Titles change. Jobs end. Circumstances shift. Character remains. When I reached my car, I paused and looked back at the house one final time. The evening had not ended with revenge. It had ended with clarity. And that mattered more. My father once told me that respect earned through appearances disappears quickly, but respect earned through integrity lasts a lifetime. Standing beneath the stars, I finally understood how right he had been. People may laugh at what they think they see, but eventually, the truth introduces itself. And when it does, laughter usually becomes silence.